Thomas Sowell once said that the first rule of economics is scarcity, but the first rule of politics is to disregard the first rule of economics. For a decade, the politics of the indie animation movement has been telling us that the old gates are down and that the artists finally own the means of production. The argument being made here is not that independent animation is bad, nor that the people who built the movement lacked conviction or sincerity. The argument is narrower and much more uncomfortable than either of these claims. The argument is that a set of economic conditions that are identifiable, measurable, and largely unacknowledged in the discourse has and will produce outcomes that contradict the stated goals of the movement. That the structure which replaced the studio system replicates the functions of the studio system while changing the vocabulary, and that the incentive gradients which shaped creator behavior under the old system continue to shape creator behavior under the new one because the incentives were never fundamentally altered. When the incentives are unchanged, outcomes are predictable. The outcomes were predictable. They were predicted implicitly by the incentives. The politics chose not to look. The traditional studio system gatekept animation through capital and distribution. A small number of decision making entities controlled access to production funding and audience reach. Creators who wished to produce animation at a professional scale required the approval of those entities. The entities applied criteria, commercial viability, demographic fit, advertiser compatibility, that shaped what was made and what was not. The indie movement proposed a structural remedy. Direct distribution platforms eliminate the need for institutional intermediaries. If a creator can reach an audience without a studio's distribution infrastructure, the gatekeeping function disappears. The audience becomes the arbiter of what gets made. This analysis was partially correct. The specific institutional gatekeepers of the broadcast and cable era lost their exclusive control over distribution. A pilot that would have died in a development meeting at a major studio could now reach over 1 million people on YouTube. What the analysis failed to account for was the difference between eliminating a specific set of gatekeepers and eliminating the gatekeeping function itself. The function persisted, the personnel changed. The criteria changed. The vocabulary changed. The structural role, deciding which creators received the resources necessary to continue producing, did not change. Replacing a gatekeeper is not the same as removing a gate. The question of who decides what gets funding has a clear answer under the indie model. The funding base decides. The Patreon subscribers, the merchandise purchasers, the crowdfunding backers. This is characterized as democratic. The audience, rather than institutional executives, determines which projects receive resources. This characterization is not necessarily wrong, it is merely incomplete. The funding base for independent animation follows the Pareto distribution with usual severity. A small number of high spending supporters generate the majority of revenue sustaining most independent animation projects. The departure of those high spending supporters is sufficient to make a project economically non viable. Their preferences, therefore, function as criteria. Their spending patterns function as a green light mechanism. Their demographic profile, which is identifiable, consistent, and well documented, functions as an implicit content requirement. The content that receives funding is content that satisfies those criteria. The content that does not satisfy those criteria does not receive the funding. The creator who produces the former continues, the creator who produces the latter does not. This is a gatekeeping function. It operates through market mechanisms rather than institutional ones. It lacks the visibility of a rejection letter from a development executive. But the economic consequence, some work gets made, some does not, based on criteria external to the work itself, is identical. The selection pressure is identical to the studio system. Only the selector changed. A reference price is the price against which consumers evaluate the fairness of any given transaction. Once a reference price is established for a category of goods, it is extraordinarily resistant to upward revision regardless of changes in production cost or quality. The reference price for animated content distributed on internet platforms was established at zero before the current indie animation movement existed. It was established by Flash animation culture, by Newgrounds, by the early architecture of Newground, by a decade of creators distributing work freely in exchange for attention. By the time the movement emerged as a coherent economic phenomenon, the consumer expectation was fixed. The consequence of this is straightforward. A creator cannot charge $3 or $2 or $1 per episode for an animated series distributed online. The attempt to charge any amount of money will be experienced by the consumer not as a fair price for a valuable product, but as an overcharge relative to the established reference price of zero. Engagement will not materialize at a price point above zero, regardless of the quality of the work. The animation is therefore not a commercial product. It cannot be sold by itself. Its production costs cannot be directly recouped through consumer transactions. The creator who treats animation as a commercial product that generates revenue through consumption will find that the economics do not close. The animation is an advertisement. It generates emotional attachment and parasocial investment, which then are monetized through adjacent commercial activities. The animation is the cost of acquiring the audience relationship. The audience relationship is the asset. The asset is monetized through mechanisms that are not animation. This is not a business model that was chosen. It is a business model that was imposed by the reference price established before any individual creator arrived. Given that direct revenue from animated content is not achievable, the economic viability of any independent animation project depends on whether the project can generate sufficient parasocial investment to monetize through adjacent mechanisms. Two such mechanisms exist at meaningful scale. The first is merchandise, physical objects associated with the property's characters and aesthetic. Merchandise revenue requires that a property achieve hyperfixation scale, the threshold at which a portion of the audience is sufficiently invested to purchase physical objects as an expression of that investment. Below hyperfixation scale, merchandise does not generate meaningful revenue. Above it, merchandise can substantially offset production costs. The second is crowdfunding through subscription platforms. This mechanism is more precisely described as a subsidy than a revenue stream. Subscribers are not purchasing episodes, they are voluntarily transferring resources to sustain the production of content, they have already established will be delivered to them free of charge. The transaction is a donation structured as a subscription. Its continuance depends not on contractual obligation but on maintained goodwill, a substantially less durable foundation. Both mechanics are downstream of audience size. Neither generates revenue prior to the establishment of a sufficient audience. The establishment of a sufficient audience requires the prior production and distribution of free content. The production of free content requires resources. The resources must come from somewhere other than the content. The sequence is closed. There is no entry point that does not require either pre-existing capital, pre-existing audience, or an extended period of uncompensated production. The creator who has none of these things does not have a viable path to economic sustainability through this model, regardless of the quality of their work. The animation is not a business. The animation is a loss leader for a merchandise business that requires a scale most independent creators will never reach. The economic literature on competitive advantage identifies the moat as a structural feature that allows an incumbent to sustain a position against competitive pressure. In the context of independent animation, the moat has two components. The first is pre-existing cultural capital, an audience assembled prior to the launch of the animation project, which can be deployed onto the project at launch to generate the initial engagement metrics that demonstrate audience proof to potential institutional partners. The second merchandise infrastructure, IP with a sufficient established audience, investment to generate merchandise revenue that subsidizes ongoing production costs, reducing the dependency on new audience acquisition to maintain economic viability. The success cases of the indie animation movement uniformly possessed one or both of these components prior to their most commercially significant launches. The audiences were not built by the successful projects, they were brought to the successful projects by creators who had accumulated cultural capital through prior work. This observation is not a criticism of those creators, it is an identification of the actual precondition for success in this economic structure. The precondition is not talent, the precondition is not dedication, even though dedication is necessary. The precondition is prior cultural capital of sufficient scale to generate the initial engagement that the model requires. The model does not produce new entrants at the top from scratch, it rewards those who already had proximity to the top. The gate is lower than the studio system gate, it is not absent. William Baumol identified in 1966 a structural cost problem in industries where labor productivity cannot be increased through technological substitution. The canonical illustration is the performing arts. A string quartet performing Beethoven in 2026 requires the same four musicians and the same duration as a string quartet performing Beethoven in 1826. The labor input cannot be changed without changing the nature of the product. But the wages of those musicians must compete with the broader economy. The cost of the string quartet therefore rises continuously while its output does not scale. Animation is subject to a particularly heavy version of this dynamic. The tools of animation production have been substantially democratized by technological development. The cost of hardware and software necessary to produce animation has decreased significantly. This democratization was real and consequential. The skilled labor required to produce animation at professional quality, however, has not been similarly democratized. The experienced animator, the voice director, the composer, the writer, these inputs cannot be substituted by cheaper alternatives without degrading the product. Their wages must compete with the broader economy. Those wages have risen and will continue to rise. The consequence is a widening gap between the cost of production and the revenue ceiling. The revenue ceiling is anchored at zero by the reference price, but the production cost floor rises with the labor market. The gap between them grows every year. The set of entities capable of sustaining production within that gap shrinks every year. The democratization of tools was temporary. The cost disease was structural. The semiconductor industry offers a structural analogy that clarifies the trajectory. In the early decades of the industry, the capital requirements for competitive participation were high but not prohibitive. Small entities could produce competitive products. The barrier to entry was primarily knowledge rather than capital. The industry was dispersed. As the technology advanced, each successive generation of fabrication capability required substantially greater capital investments. The cost of maintaining competitive production capacity increased faster than any individual entity below a certain scale could accommodate. The industry consolidated. Today, three entities account for essentially all leading edge fabrication capacity globally. The independent designers did not disappear. They continued to produce designs of considerable sophistication and value, but they produced those designs for fabrication by the three surviving entities. The design layer has creative autonomy. The production layer has been consolidated. The designers operate within a structural dependency they did not choose and cannot escape through talent or effort alone. The indie animation industry is following a structurally similar trajectory at a slower pace, or maybe at a similar pace. Rising production costs are limiting the viability of operation below a certain scale. The entities that will survive the consolidation phase will possess the infrastructure, audience pools, merchandise systems, production capability that smaller creators require access to. Creative autonomy within structural dependency. The vocabulary of independence within the economics of consolidation. Primitive accumulation describes the historical phase in which the conditions for capitalist production are established through the concentration of resources in fewer hands. The structural outcome is consistent across industries and eras. A competitive landscape of many small participants consolidates into a smaller number of entities with sufficient capital to survive the next phase of competition. The independent animation industry is currently in this phase. The entities that have survived the selection process of the past decade are accumulating the capital that subsequent phases of competition will require. The accumulation is not a result of predatory behavior. It is the result of ordinary operation of incentive structures in a market with the specific characteristics described in the preceding sections. The creators who enter the market now without pre-existing cultural capital or merchandise infrastructures or connections face those accumulated entities as competitors. The competitive advantage of the incumbents compounds over time. The gap between incumbents and new entrants grows. The new entrants who succeed will do so by providing something the incumbents cannot efficiently produce. This is the same in relationship that independent studios had to the major studios they were supposedly replacing. The vocabulary differs, but the structural relationship does not. The movement built new institutions. Institutions, once built, follow institutional logic. Institutional logic produces institutional behavior. Institutional behavior includes the defense of accumulated advantages against new competitive threats. The gate was not removed, it was simply reconstructed in the language of liberation. The politics said that the creators own the means of production. The economics say that the means of production cost more every year. The politics said that the gates are down. The economy says that the gates have moved. The politics said that this was better for the artist. The economics of the situation says that the artists work harder, earn less, produce content priced at zero for gatekeepers who don't call themselves gatekeepers, while also not being paid a union pension or a union healthcare fund, while also subsidizing their own mental health for the company. The incentive structure of the independent animation industry does not reward talent in excess of what the studio system rewarded. It does not reward dedication in excess of what the studio system rewarded. It does not provide economic security in excess of what the studio system provided. In several measurable respects, it provides less of each. What it provides is the simple experience of autonomy and ownership within constraints that are as binding as those of the system it replaced. The constraints are less visible. They are experienced as market outcomes rather than institutional decisions. They are, therefore, more difficult to contest and more difficult to organize against. This is not an accident of implementation. This is a predictable consequence of the incentive structure. The incentives select for the accumulation of cultural capital and production infrastructure. They do not select for the distribution of those resources to new entrants. No political narrative about liberation changes the incentive structure. Only changes to the underlying economics can do that. The first rule of economics is scarcity. The scarcity that governs independent animation is not of talent or passion or creative vision. It is of the economic conditions under which talent, passion, and creative vision can become a livelihood rather than a subsidiary of an industry that does not compensate them. The incentives have not changed. If you made it to the end of the video, give me your favorite obscure independent animation project. Me personally, there is this, I think it was Hungarian movie. It was called The Tragedy of Man. Wonderful movie. You should watch it. I'll see you guys next time. Peace out.